Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Women's View Muharram Special Live. Today, inshallah, we're going to be speaking about the concept of sacrifice in the light of Al-Baneen alayhi salam. As always, this is a live show, so please do feel free to call the number on the screen and join the discussion. Or you can leave a comment on our Facebook page, or you can tweet me at Zahira Mamdani or at Ahlulbayt TV. My guest today is Sister Zahra Jaffer. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much.
So, when we were talking about this topic, sacrifice is such a, I wouldn't say vague, but it is something difficult to define and, explain what it is. So, just to start off the discussion, what do we mean when we talk about sacrifice?
Yeah, well, a dictionary definition of sacrifice is the surrender or destruction of something that is prized or desirable for the sake of something considered as having a higher or more pressing claim. So basically, it's just giving up something that you hold dear to your heart for a greater purpose. And as Muslims, we know that there is no greater purpose than the service of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the service of the Ahlulbayt. So when we talk about sacrifice, we talk about sacrifices we make in this cause. But I also think that sacrifice is very closely linked with the whole concept of love. We find that when there is love, when there is a great love, we find that sacrifices are always made. So people are willing to sacrifice many different things for the sake of the ones that they love. So these two concepts are strongly linked.
Do you think there's like a positive correlation, say, between love and sacrifice? The more you love something, the more you're willing to give up for it.
Definitely, definitely. And we find so many examples of this. One of the most poignant examples that we find of sacrifice in our daily lives is the sacrifices that a mother is willing to make for their children, because this is one of the greatest loves that we see exhibited in our lives, besides obviously the love of Allah. And it's really interesting because we always find this connection between the love of Allah and the love of our mothers. There are the traditions that say that Allah's love is 70 times the love of our mothers. So understanding the love of a mother and the sacrifices that a mother makes can really help us to understand this whole concept of sacrificing for Allah. 'Cause it was really interesting. I was reading up about some of the sacrifices that mothers make in the animal kingdom, because we find that this maternal instinct, this whole concept of sacrificing and loving your children, sacrificing for and loving your children, is not something that's just restricted to us. Yeah. We find that it's something exhibited throughout all of nature. One really interesting case was there's this type of spider who actually sacrifices her own life. The mother spider sacrifices her own life for her young, to the extent that her body is the first meal for the young. Wow. Yeah, so she actively encourages her children to eat her own body so that they get the nutrition they require. Wow. So you can really appreciate the greatness of this love and this sacrifice.
So like you just gave an example of that, I think it's safe to say that sacrifice is like a really universal underlying concept in everyone's lives. And I think we see a lot more of it, and we see how manifest it is during the 10 days of Muharram, because it's this ongoing underlying theme. So what role do you think sacrifice plays in Islam?
I think sacrifice is one of the key ideas in Islam. When we talk about Islam, we're talking about submission. The word Islam means submission. And you cannot truly submit to something unless you're willing to sacrifice. We find that this whole concept of sacrifice has been around not just since the beginning of Islam, but the beginning of humanity itself. With the creation of Hazrat Adam alayhi salam, we find that we know that his sons Habil and Qabil were required to make sacrifices to Allah. And so it's been there right from the very beginning. And Allah talks about this whole concept of sacrifice a lot in the Holy Quran. And one of the key verses, which is always quoted when talking about sacrifices, is from Surah Al Imran, ayah number 92, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لَن تَنَالُوا الْبِرَّ حَتَّى تُنْفِقُوا مِمَّا تُحِبُّونَ. So never will you attain that status of bir, which is a high level of piety and righteousness and goodness. It's a very high station. So you will never be able to achieve that station unless you are willing to sacrifice from what you love. Yeah. So this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us. If we want to get close to Him, we have to be able to sacrifice what we love.
Yeah. What examples of sacrifice do you think are demonstrated in our own lives?
I think, as we've talked about, the concept of sacrifice is closely linked with love. Mm-hmm. So we find sacrifice exhibited between any group of people who love each other. Yeah. So we talked about the sacrifices of mothers for their children. We see it, even children for their parents, brothers for their sisters, friends for each other. So wherever this love exists, we'll always see sacrifice demonstrated. I think, as we've mentioned, the most poignant example of that is a mother's sacrifice for their children.
Like we mentioned before, I said that sacrifice is one of the themes that really comes out during Muharram because it's such an obvious component of what happened on Ashura. And we often say that the greatest example of sacrifice was that day. The answer is fairly obvious, but for those of us who don't know, why do we say that?
I think there's many reasons why Karbala was such a significant sacrifice. I think when we've already discussed how it's so natural, it's so part of our nature to sacrifice for the ones that we love in this life. For example, mothers for children and parents. So what we find in Karbala is almost a reversal of nature. Yeah. We find that especially the mothers in Karbala, for example, they're not trying to save their children, they're not trying to protect their children, but they're actively encouraging their children to go and die. Yeah. And they're going to die for this great purpose. So when we really put into perspective this whole maternal love, and we see that role reversal, it's absolutely astonishing. And I think it's one of the greatest demonstration of that ayah of Quran, that they have achieved that great station of bir because they were willing to sacrifice everything that they loved. Yeah. There's not one thing that they loved that they would not be willing to sacrifice for Allah. Yeah. And it's really interesting because when we look through history, we find that there's lots of different cases where people have sacrificed. And one of the most important sacrifices we talk about is the sacrifice of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. His sacrifice of his son Ismail was so significant that there's the day of Eid dedicated to him. Yeah. All the rituals of Hajj are revolve around him. But we still find that Karbala is an even greater sacrifice. And we know this for many reasons. One of the really interesting things is that even though Prophet Ibrahim was completely submitting to the will of Allah, when it came to the moment that he wanted to strike his son, he blindfolded himself. He didn't know if he would be able to bear actually witnessing the death of his son. So he protected himself by blindfolding himself. When we compare that to Karbala, we find Imam Hussein alayhi salam and the mothers and all of the people who sacrificed in Karbala. Not only were they having to sacrifice, but they had to witness the sacrifice. And it really draws a comparison to that moment when Imam Hussein has to lift the spear from Hazrat Ali Akbar, because that's one of the moments where there was no blindfold for him. There was no relief for him at all. But he had to be fully sacrificing. And that's why Allah says in the Holy Quran, when talking about Prophet Ibrahim, that he ransomed the sacrifice of Prophet Ismail with a greater sacrifice. Yeah. And dhibhun azim is the word in the Quran. It's in Surah number 37. And this dhibhun azim is Karbala, this great sacrifice. And because there is no greater. Yeah.
And just like sidetracking a bit, like the parallel that you drew between Prophet Ibrahim and Imam Hussein, it's really amazing because Prophet Ibrahim, like you said, he was tested. Allah tested whether he was willing to sacrifice, but he didn't actually have to do it in the end.
Exactly.
And yet, because of this act and because of his willingness, he was honoured in such a way that, you know, there are so many rituals, and like you said, their Eid, and it just makes you realise how much importance then do we have to give to Imam Hussein, who actually did have to make the sacrifice. So moving on, let's get a bit more specific. We live in the time of our Imam. What kinds of sacrifices do you think that women in our time now have to make?
I think the sacrifices of women are very significant and can be really divided into the different sections within a woman's life. Because sacrifices are present throughout one's life. So in the stage of being a daughter, there are many sacrifices one has to make. For example, we know that obedience to our parents is a wajibat upon us. It's something we have to do. So often we find that as daughters, we have to sacrifice what we might want to do, our desires and our wishes, to please our parents. So that's one form of sacrifice. But as the stages in a woman's life progress, the sacrifices become greater. For example, when a woman becomes a wife, there are different sacrifices to be made. Usually, a wife has to sacrifice her own way of living that she's been used to, and has to sacrifice her family to a degree. So that's a further level of sacrifice. But as we've mentioned, the pinnacle of sacrifice is when one becomes a mother. And we cannot see any other type of sacrifice that is greater than the sacrifice that a mother makes for her children.
So at the beginning of the show, we said this was going to be sacrifice in the light of al-Banin. And we will speak about her sacrifices later on. But just to start off with, what do we know about the marriage of al-Banin to Imam Ali alayhi salam, just for a bit of context?
It's really interesting, the story behind the marriage of Imam Ali and al-Banin alayhi salam. Imam Ali wanted a wife who was courageous. And we all know this story, that he wanted a wife that was courageous so that he would be able to bear a son who was courageous. And that son would be the one who would defend Imam Hussein alayhi salam in Karbala. So Imam Ali went to his brother Aqil, and because Aqil knew the genealogy of the Arab families very, very well, so he asked him to suggest a family which was particularly known for their shuja'ah, that bravery and courageousness. And Aqil suggested al-Banin. But what is often less well known is that from al-Banin's perspective, the day that she found out about the proposal of Imam Ali, that day, before that, she had a dream. And she dreamt that there were three stars and the moon, and they all came and fell into her lap. And these three stars, and the moon, they represent her 4 sons. So she would have a proposal and she would have a marriage which led to the birth of 4 sons, one of which would be the moon. Yeah. And obviously we know Hazrat Abbas alayhi salam is the moon of Bani Hashim. And so that's such a beautiful image that she knew from the moment that she accepted the proposal of Imam Ali what this was leading to.
So, I mean, like we said, you know, we can never do justice to the sacrifice of al-Banin. She was the epitome of sacrifice. But how did al-Banin demonstrate the concept of sacrifice during her life?
Well, we know that she had 4 sons. Her sons' names was obviously Hazrat Abbas alayhi salam, Jaffer, Uthman, and Abdullah. And we know that she gave up all of her 4 sons on the day of Ashura. Yeah. There is no single mother who gave that many children on the day of Ashura. And she was willing to sacrifice them with no hesitation. There was no question in her mind that all of her sons should be sacrificed for Imam Hussein. And this is really epitomized by the fact that she thought her own children's lives were so insignificant compared to the life of Imam Hussein. And this is demonstrated when she heard the news about Karbala. When a messenger came, she asked him, "Tell me about Abu Abdullah, tell me about Imam Hussein." And the messenger said condolences on the death of Hazrat Abbas, and condolences on the death of each of her 4 sons. But she's like, I didn't ask about them. I asked about Abu Abdullah. I asked about Imam Hussein. Why are you telling me about my sons? I wanted to give them as a sacrifice, but I wanted to protect Abu Abdullah. So tell me his news. And when he heard the news of the shahadat of Abu Abdullah, that is when she said, all of the arteries of my heart are torn. May all of my children and whatever that exists in the heaven be sacrificed for the sake of Imam Hussein. So that is when that was the epitome of her sacrifice. That Imam Hussein was all that mattered to her.
We speak about Mamdani's sacrifice, and we spoke, like today's whole show is revolving around the sacrifice of Mamdani. But we know that on the day of Ashura, so many people made sacrifices, though she wasn't the only one to make a sacrifice. And not to put one sacrifice above the other, but what is it about Mamdani's sacrifice that makes it different from other sacrifices that took place on that day?
I think that's a brilliant question. As we've mentioned, she gave the most number of sons, but that's just one level. Another level is when we look at the sacrifice of Mamdani alayhi salam, we find that her sacrifice extended beyond the day of Ashura, which is what makes it so significant. We find that her sacrifice began from the moment of accepting the proposal of Imam Ali alayhi salam. And there are many reasons for this. When we think about it, when we look at the history, we find that Mamdani alayhi salam was only 17 to 20 years old at the time. She was unmarried before that, but Imam Ali alayhi salam had married Bibi Fatima alayhi salam, and he had married 2 other wives after that. So, and also at this stage, he was actually under house arrest. He wasn't the Khalifa of the Muslims. He at that stage, and so it was going to be a difficult life. She was going into a ready-made family, and there was, as an ordinary woman in that position would find that very challenging. But she made so many sacrifices that we find that she put it all into perspective. Though she knew that what she was looking for in Imam Ali alayhi salam, that that the fact that he was of the Ahlulbayt, that was all that mattered to her. And she, before she even entered the house of Imam Ali alayhi salam, she sent a message to the children saying that I will not enter this house unless you accept me as a servant of yours. And another stipulation that she set was that she should not be called Fatima, because her actual name is Fatima, but her title, her kunya, is Mamdani. And so she stipulated that she should never be called Fatima in that house. So when we just look at this whole picture, we find that she made so many sacrifices just there. She sacrificed her own name. She sacrificed any pride, any kind of ego, because she knew her place before the place of Bibi Fatima alayhi salam. She knew that all her purpose in life was to serve the Ahlulbayt. So it's so many sacrifices that stretch beyond Ashura, and to me that's what makes her sacrifice that much more significant.
Definitely. This again, fairly obvious answer to this, but do you think there are many of us who would be willing to make sacrifices like that?
I think obviously the sacrifices of Mamdani are just immense. But we find that the qualities within Al-Baneen that enabled her to make these sacrifices. So even though we're not in that situation, we don't know what we would do in that situation. We're far from the level of Al-Baneen, but we can take a step back and look at the qualities within Al-Baneen that enabled her to make those sacrifices. And if we can strive to adopt those qualities, then maybe, inshaAllah, we will be able to make a fraction of the sacrifices that she was able to make. There's so many qualities. But just to name a few, her extreme love for the Ahlulbayt, her sense of vision and purpose. She knew that when she was making sacrifices, that there was a greater goal. She had that in the forefront of her mind.
She seemed to know from day one, since the day that she was approached by Imam Ali, that it wasn't going to be a normal husband-wife relationship. It wasn't going to be a normal kind of marrying into a family. She almost lowered herself beyond the role of a wife, and in doing that, she became something even greater. So, yeah, Al-Baneen's sacrifice was very unique. And a friend of mine always says, she said, just last week I was speaking to her, and she said to me, SubhanAllah, that Baneen, her sacrifice, it really did come back to her in a much greater way, because she gave away 4 sons in Karbala, and now she's buried amongst 4 imams in Jannatul Baqi'. So there's justice and everything. Just before we move on, I think we have a caller on the line. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
How are you?
Alhamdulillah, I'm good. I just wanted to say, great show. I'm watching now, and it's a great topic as well, and something we should all concentrate on.
Oh, thank you. Any other comments about?
Yeah, sure. I had a question. Basically, this is a question which people usually pose to me, so I just wanted to hear your perspective on it.
Okay.
Many of the sacrifices that the guest spoke of and that you spoke of demonstrate a greater sacrifice. But the greater sacrifice that the Ahlulbayt and those individuals gave. However, many of us will never be placed in such circumstances which will require us to sacrifice such things. So, in your opinion and the guest's opinion, what sacrifice can we as individuals living in the modern era give to religion? Because, we should all sacrifice something for religion. So, what can we actually give to religion? And sorry, my son's screaming in the background.
No, fine.
I think that's the question.
Okay, thank you so much for calling in.
Thank you so much, and may Allah reward you all for your hard work.
Okay, so that was one of the questions we planned to speak about anyway. So, like Zahra said, our time is very different, and we won't be put in those exact positions that, the people like Baneen or anyone else who lived in that time were put in. But at the same time, we also have sacrifices living in the time of the Imam, and these are our tests. So what kinds of sacrifices do you think we are faced with that we should be able to make?
Definitely. I think before actually thinking about the sacrifices, we wanted to just make a point that whenever we hear stories from history, there's always lessons for us to learn, and there's always going to be ways that we can apply it to our lives. Allah says in the Holy Quran, when talking about the story of Prophet Yusuf, He says that in these lessons there is ibrah, which is the lessons we can learn. And when you look at this word, it actually means a bridge. When you look at the derivation, it means a bridge. It's a bridge from their time to ours. So there's always going to be a connection we can make whenever we hear these stories. So yes, there are many different sacrifices we can make that are relevant to our time. One of the sacrifices we make is the sacrifice of wealth and possessions. The sadaqah that we give, the charity, and there is so much emphasis put on this. But there are other sacrifices that perhaps are even more important. Sacrifices of things such as our time and our energy and our efforts. Because that's something that's valuable to us. Our time is a precious commodity that we should be willing to sacrifice in the way of Ahlulbayt. Getting involved with initiatives that support the Ahlulbayt and spending time in spreading the message of the Ahlulbayt. These are all ways in which we can sacrifice our time. And remember that we talked about the ayah in Quran that talks about لن تنالوا البر حتى تنفقوا مما تحبون. So Allah is telling us that we have to be able to sacrifice everything that we love. So in our time, in this day and age, we have to think and make a list of the things that we love in this life. Because we know that our heart can only really possess one lover.
Yeah.
There's and everything that we love in this life should really be in line with the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Yeah.
So anything else that we love, we should really reflect on this and see how we can make sacrifices of those things that we love.
Yeah.
So just some of the things we may love are our family and friends.
Yeah.
And we saw that in Karbala they had to physically sacrifice them, they had to die. But there are other ways in which we can sacrifice our family and friends. Just to give you an example, sometimes we may find that the people that we love are close to us, will tell us different things, give us different advices, but sometimes they may take us towards Allah and sometimes they may take us away from Allah. We have to be able to assess if I am told to do something, if by my friends and my family, the people that I hold dear, will I hold their instructions greater or will I hold the instructions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala greater? So even in this way, we find that if we can put the instructions of Allah greater, we're making a sacrifice of them and we're putting our love of Allah first.
Yeah. That's an excellent example of sacrificing our family and friends in our generation. Unfortunately, we do have to go for a break now, but we will continue this topic of sacrifice after the break. So join us in a few minutes. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.